Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yourwolfsdengaming here in the wonderful world of video games and technology, and today we're going to be taking a look at Songbringer for the PC. Let's take a look, shall we?
Does not compute.
After requesting a code for Songbringer well over a year ago, with the thought that it was coming out in 2016, it not coming out in said year, and then me working on a new novel, I forgot about the game, and I just forgot about the game. When talking to the developer back in 2016, I opted to review the game in its finished and release state, rather than check out the beta version and possibly mitigate the experience of the game's full release. It's now 2017, the game is actually out, and with a little ding of the email notification alerting me to a new press email with a Steam code attached, I remembered the game immediately. It's hard to forget that sword. After all, it hums. Songbringer is a 3/4 perspective pixelated science fiction action-adventure game with light role-playing mechanics. In the game, you play the role of Rock, a dude in space who likes partying and making music. Cruising the galaxy with his buddy Jib, they explore space along with the rest of the crew of a ship called Songbringer. You know, cue the title sequence. After crashing onto the world of Elzira, that's probably how you pronounce it, totally, it's up to cool dude Rock and his robot friend to stop an ancient evil from doing ancient, evil-y things. Packed with pixelated sword-swinging, dungeon adventuring, and not subtle in the least Legend of Zelda inspirations, Rock will travel through a handful of dungeons, collect power-ups, upgrade his weapons, defeat bosses, and save the universe from the Snake People. I am gonna give them credit right now. There's Lamia and Nagas in the game that you can fight, so plus 1,000 internet points for that. I mean, we don't have a scoring system, but if we did, that right there would bring this game up to like an 11 out of 10. Songbringer starts with Rock crashed off his bike. After picking up the nano sword, or not, Rock will explore the worldscape with Jib. The player will go into dungeons, kill baddies, find some nice loot, and help save the world. As you explore the dungeons and follow the story, the game will hint to certain larger events playing in the background, which is a nice touch. It's a fairly bog-standard story, but it works just fine. Rock and Jib have the occasional bits of back-and-forth banter. I was worried that the game was going to take itself too seriously or have the main character's dude factor just become annoying. Luckily, the banter isn't long between characters, and Rock's dudeness is kept to a few lines. Ultimately, Songbringer's Legend of Zelda in a pixel art style with more memorable visual appeal. You have different dungeons with a few themes, some mostly passable puzzles to solve, and then a boss following each dungeon. Rock's main weapon, if the player chooses to pick it up, is the nano sword. You'll also have the opportunity to find a hat and some different flavors of bombs, as well as some loot drops off of enemies and random items, if you attack them found in the overworld. Occasionally, Rock will also find currency to buy things from some cave stores. The things you can buy vary in usefulness, but it's nice that there's an option. What isn't nice about the stores is that there was an item for 420 diamonds, which is the currency in the game, and I couldn't buy it because the game wouldn't physically let me pick up more than 255. I think it might be a glitch, but even if it's not, the game doesn't indicate that in any way you can increase your maximum wallet size, so that's kind of frustrating. There's also the crafting, which is limited, again, in usefulness, and you can only craft things, at least from what I've played, on the ship Songbringer, which, story-wise, you can only enter like a quarter way through the game, and you're only there for a short amount of time, so yeah. I wish there was more things you could combine in the game. For example, you can get like acid power-ups and ice power-ups and fire power-ups, and you can combine them with the things you have, like the nano sword or the top hat, but the problem with that is, if you didn't find them once you go to the ship Songbringer, and then Songbringer, spoiler alert, something happens, so you can't go back on the ship, then you just can't craft anything anymore. Or at least from what I could tell, which kinda stinks. The combat isn't bad either, and it felt quite rewarding at times. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't have issues. For one, the hitboxes. Because touching most enemies hurts you, which isn't a bad thing necessarily, it means you have to stay a good chunk back from enemies, limiting the use of the sword. This would be fine if Rock had any ranged weapons, but his ranged weapons just don't do as much damage in comparison to the sword. What's worse is that the player has a blink ability that he'll find which allows him to teleport a few feet ahead of him. This would be fine, but because rock gets hurt by touching some enemies, it means causing you damage. Because you can't directly control where you blink to in terms of visually seeing where you'll end up once blinking, this means upgrading the blink ability is kind of useless. These hitbox issues go double for the player. I died at the final boss a lot, and not because I didn't do well, but because the player's hitbox seems to change. Either that or the attack hitboxes, meaning the actual attack's hitbox, is changing. The final boss in particular uses like a lightning attack that strikes you from the sky, and that killed me despite clearly not being even close to the strike. Sure, the player has a shield rock can find and then use if he stands still, but it takes a second to activate, which again means you can't control when you're being hit. This only happened with the final boss, but it was still frustrating. It doesn't help that a lot of the bosses you fight in tight spaces, limiting the amount of room you have to dodge. The game makes the final boss in particular practically impossible to hit at certain points because enemies don't signal when they'll move and where they'll move to. Once a boss jumps up in the air and disappears, they could land anywhere without knowing. What's worse than that is that the animation time for the bosses between starting an animation attack and the actual attack often don't give the player enough time to get out of the way. Again, it's a minor issue, but it's worth addressing. These issues could have been prevented if range combat was more prevalent or useful, or if the player had a shield they could pull up at whim, and not just when they're standing still. The combat ultimately boils down to mashing the attack button, and there's no shield or secondary attack with any of the weapons. It means just mashing the attack button while being forced, at least in the beginning, to take some hits that could have probably been avoided if the former two things were present. However, regardless of the issues, I still had fun and played through the game even with my frustrations. I'm not sure if it's just because I don't own Hyper Light Drifter, as I've been told the similarities in gameplay are similar, or because the combat was still good enough to keep me playing. I felt satisfaction from defeating bosses and dungeons at least, so I'd say that's something. The world's also procedurally generated, and it works. I wouldn't say it adds replayability, but it works fine. There's also a co-op mode I didn't try because I'm incredibly lonely, and a permadeath mode, which was fun. Visually, the game looks great. Even being procedurally generated, the world looks fantastic to wander through. Great weather diversity, dynamic lighting, reflections, and more. The choice of colors is appealing, and the game just overall looks good. As with other game reviews I've done, the music's fine for the game it's in. However, it's not on the levels that I'd buy the soundtrack. Take that for what you will. At the least, if nothing else, the bizarre tunes were nice to hear while exploring the dungeons. The sound effects are nice and punchy, and the music is technological and mysterious. Both fit the game just fine. In terms of controls, I have a few issues. You can adjust between two different modes for graphical fidelity, you have the option for an unlocked FPS, you can change the sound levels, and other basic things. You even have rebindable controls for both controller and keyboard, but there's an issue, which is to say, you can't actually see the controls. At one point, I wanted to look at the controls I set to make sure I couldn't make them better, only to find that you can't do that. If you check to rebind the controls, you have to rebind all the controls, not just one button or function. It doesn't even let you exit the menu until you rebind all the controls over again. It's not, again, a huge issue, but it's, again, still noteworthy to mention. Other than that, the developer gets +1 internet points, for whatever that's worth, for having a borderless window mode that's actually a borderless window and doesn't just break the game, and +1,000 internet points for having that to be set to default. Overall, I had fun with Songbringer. I've been told it's similar to Hyper Light Drifter in more ways than one, and both are $19.99. Regardless, the game was fun and refreshing. I don't know if the price tag fits the bill of what I played, but considering my initial experience lasted around 8 hours, I'd say it's at least worth it in terms of raw ratio of hours played to the price. But I'd still be more inclined to suggest the game on a sale. This has been Yourwolfsdengaming taking a look at Songbringer for the PC. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you like the content, maybe stick around. I got a bunch of more content coming up in the woodworks. A Warhammer The End Times Vermintide review eventually coming up. And yeah, there's other stuff as well. You should take a look. So yeah, this has been Yourwolfsdengaming. Hope you enjoy, and I'll see you all in the next one, ladies and gentlemen.